We're going to continue talking about organisational cultures. In this slide deck, the majority of the models that I'll be using are actually drawn from analysis of national culture, not strictly organisational cultures. But all of these models can actually be used to understand organisational culture just as well. And at the same time, you might pick up one or two things about the difference between nationalities, which could be of use anyway because we all tend to work in international environments anyway. It's very rare to find a workplace that doesn't have a mix of cultures, especially in Australia. So the first model that I want to look at is Hofstadter's work. Now, Hofstadter did some fascinating research, generally involving employees from IBM. So this piece of research started to try and gain an understanding of what the cultural differences were in different IBM branches. And Hofstadter ended up using 4 different ways of breaking down culture. So 4 different main characteristics. We're only going to look at 2 of them today. They are power distance and individualism versus collectivism. You can look at the other 2 in your free time if you want. They're masculinity and femininity and something else which I've forgotten. I'm sorry. It's not in these slides, so it's not at the top of my mind. But let's talk about power distance. Power distance is very generally a measure of perceptions of superiors' style of decision making, fear of disagreeing with superiors, and the types of decision making that subordinates tend to prefer in their superiors. So, a low power distance environment, we tend to assume that inequality in society should be minimized, that this is a good thing, and that superiors are fundamentally like me. They're not different kinds of people. And as such, everyone should have equal rights. In this kind of worldview, the way to change a social system is actually by redistributing power, so giving power to different people. And the use of power is subject to judgments of good or evil, so we can make statements about whether someone is using their power in a just and reasonable way. People at various levels feel less threatened and are generally more prepared to trust people at different levels because we all tend to assume that everyone is basically on the same playing field. Contrast this with a high power distance environment. This has a very different worldview. In a high power distance environment, it's assumed that everyone has a place and that the structure, the social structure, kind of tells you your place in the environment and also protects you. In this kind of environment, superiors and subordinates are actually seen as qualitatively different. And because they are different kinds of people, superiors are actually better people, it's right that superiors have privilege. In this kind of environment, because superiors are assumed to be actually better in some ways, power is assumed to be a basic fact of society, and questions about whether power is used appropriately or inappropriately aren't really credible kinds of questions. Power isn't really subject to questions about good or evil. Now, the way to change the social system in this kind of environment is actually to dethrone those in power, to topple them, to chop their head off, and generally replace it by someone else, usually maintaining the same structure. In this kind of environment, other people are a potential threat to one's power and generally can't be trusted. So we've got 2 very different kind of environments. If you want to, take a moment to pause the video and think about the country that you've grown up in. Think about the kind of organisation that you work in and what kind of power distance environment that might be. Now, let's talk about individualism versus collectivism. So the level of individualism in a society or a company or a culture will affect the reasons for complying, how decisions are made, the types of people that will be admitted, to positions of social influence, that kind of thing. So a low individualism environment tends to be one where you value company provision. So what can the company do for me? What training or conditions are there? There tends to be emotional dependence on the company. So one's identity comes through the company, and managers aspire to orderliness. So we all want everyone to behave according to the company rules in the same way. In this kind of environment, security is rated as important, and decisions tend to be made by the group. I mean, we're valuing conformity, so everyone has to agree with what's being done. And in this kind of environment, social relations are predetermined by in-groups. So it's very much about whether you're part of the right group, whether you're part of the group that has decision rights in that environment. Contrast this with a high individualism environment. Here, what's valued is personal life. One is not identifying oneself by the company, so you're emotionally independent from the company. Here you get questions around work-life balance. You get a life outside of work. And people tend to value jobs based on how the job fits with their particular values, not those of the collective company. So here, managers aspire to things like leadership and variety, and autonomy is valued as important. In this kind of environment, individual decisions are also valued. There's a place for the hero, the person who stands out for the crowd. And again, this is about who you know, but in slightly different ways, because the individual is now empowered to make specific friendships or relationships. Now again, I'd urge you to pause the video and think for a second about where your culture fits along the low individualism or high individualism scale. I find this one particularly interesting because it tells me a lot about my married life. I'm much more individualistic than my wife is. I tend to get frustrated when she goes and talks to 5 of her friends whenever there's an important decision. I'm much more individualistic. I sit by myself, work out what I want to do, and then, woe betide the person who tries to get in the way of my decision making, because it's my decision. So it helps me understand how we relate to each other and how we make decisions in very different ways. Now, I'll show you Hofstadter's rating of these scores by country. The fourth one was uncertainty avoidance. There it is. Okay, now I find this particularly interesting because Australia is right up here at the top of the list, scoring incredibly highly for individualism. So we are a particularly individualistic society. I think the only one with a higher score for individualism is the USA. Now this is useful for me to know because I'm an individualistic person in an individualistic environment, which means I'm way off the scale at one end, which is useful for me to know. So with most of these things, it's only worthwhile if it tells you something interesting, whether that is something fundamental about you personally or whether it's something fundamental about the situation you're in. A tool like this is only useful depending on the environment that it's applied in. So power distance, you can see Australia is a relatively low power distance environment, second row down at 36, and compare that with somewhere like, let's compare that with somewhere like Mexico. It's a very high power distance environment scoring at 81. So in Mexico, hierarchy and structure are very important. Somewhere like Venezuela, Yugoslavia, other high power distance environments, the Philippines as well, very high power distance. So if you're going to be working with people from one of these countries, you're probably going to need to respect hierarchy in quite a different way than you might in Australia. Now, you might also want to cast your critical eye and note that this research was done in 1980. Some things might have changed, but cultures tend to change very slowly. So let's look at Trompenaar and Hampton Tony. You might remember those names from the last slide deck. They talked about ascription-oriented versus achievement-oriented. Ascription-oriented environments tend to have male managers, and people tend to be qualified by their background. You're supposed to respect a boss regardless of whether they know everything, regardless of whether they know the right things. And status, particularly symbols of status, are very important. Decisions are challenged by those with more power, not necessarily more knowledge. Compare that with an achievement-oriented environment where you tend to get a mix of male and female managers. Now, in this kind of environment, it's about performance. Can you perform well? Are you good at your job? And respect is conditional on performance. In this kind of environment, job descriptions, titles tend to be more task-related, and decisions are open to criticism by people who actually have more power. So again, you're going to have to behave in quite different ways if you're trying to implement change in either of these environments. Now let's look at time orientation. This is Hall's research, and here we're contrasting monochronic and polychronic time. In monochronic time, things tend to be a bit more linear. You do one thing at a time, then you move to the next and the next and the next, and you deal with the task at hand. Punctuality is valued, and there's strict adherence to schedules. People tend to be quite task-oriented in this kind of environment. In polychronic times, has anyone heard the expression island time? People tend to do many things at the same time, and distraction is just accepted. It's accepted as part of what goes on. Punctuality doesn't really matter. I'm sure everyone can think of some cultures where you just kind of turn up at around the time. Compare, say, Portugal to Germany, and you'll see very different time behaviours. And here, people tend to be relationship-oriented. So it's all about building the relationship, much more so than achieving the task. Let's compare this to context dependence. Again, some of Hall's research. And this is largely about communication. In low-context communication cultures, communication is direct, explicit, and in detail. People say what they mean and they mean what they say. There's no subtext. And to understand what they're talking about, you just pay attention to the words. The aim here is to understand the message, because the message contains everything that you need. And if you want to examine this, then you're contrasting facts and opinions in the search for truth. In comparison, there are high context communication cultures. Here the message is less direct. The message tends to be implicit. You've got to listen in a very different way, and the meaning tends to be implied. Here, what you've got to pay attention to is not the words themselves, but the intention of the spoken message, which is really something quite different. The aim here is to give meaning to the spoken message by using the whole context for the message. And here what you're doing is trying to integrate facts and opinions to search for harmony. And by harmony, I mean harmony between incongruent elements. This is very useful for me. So, for instance, I have two PhD students. One is Danish and one is Indonesian. My Danish PhD student is straight down the line. She'll say, "Give it to me. Don't beat around the bush. Stop being diplomatic, Julian." My Indonesian student, he comes from a very high context communication environment, and I have to give him examples. I never criticize his work directly. I talk around things to give him an idea about where we're going. And if I criticize things directly, then I need to be very, very careful about doing things like giving opportunity to save face. So they're quite different ways of interacting. So let's look at managerial roles. So how do people see the role of the manager? What do managers actually have to do? So this study looked at the percentage of people who agreed with the phrase, "It's important for a manager to have at hand precise answers to most of the questions that subordinates may raise about their work." At one end of the scale, you've got Japan, and right down the other, you've got USA. So in Japan, it's important for managers to have precise answers. In the USA, it's less important. Now, I'd slightly relate this to the rise of managerialism, the idea that management is a profession in itself and is independent of technical expertise. You might also relate this to aspects like Japan tends to be a much higher power distance environment, and people tend to stay in companies for a lot longer period, in which case people might be promoted up through technical disciplines. In which case, managers might actually have answers to what's happening on the shop floor, for instance. In the USA, where you've been promoted from management position to management position to management position, you might, and that might have happened at 2-year intervals, you might really not have much of a great understanding about the fine details of a company. But you might be an expert in management as a discipline in itself. So, as a last framework, let's look at neutral versus effective cultures. Again, we've got Trompenaar and Hampton Turner, but this is being adapted by Comfort and Franklin. And here we're looking at the percentage of respondents who would not show emotions openly. Basically, we're looking at, is it okay to feel upset at work, or is it okay to display emotions generally? At one end of the scale, we've got Ethiopia, Japan, Poland, China, where it's not okay to show emotions. Right up the other end, we've got places like Egypt, Spain, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Philippines, where it's actually okay to express emotion. Now, think about your kind of environment. Are you working in an environment where emotions are expressed freely? And how does that change the way you communicate? How does it change what you can and can't share with your co-workers and your feeling of closeness or separation from them? If you're interested, here are some of the references that we've used in this research. And we've been talking generally about national culture, but everything that we've talked about so far is also applicable to understanding organizational, project, or change management cultures. Thank you very much.